Yeah, I'm a senior product engineer at PumasAI, and yeah, you already said the refactor that made AlgebraOfGraphics scale better. Let's get into it. So, what is AlgebraOfGraphics? I made this little illustration. I think of it as a thin layer over Makie.jl, which is one of the big visualization packages that is available in Julia. And like the cheese on top of the bread, it makes the whole thing, the whole experience much better. It gives a little bit of convenience for constructing these very common plots that you always have to do. And this is the reason why we are interested in it at Pumas AI, because our consultants need to do a lot of plots and they tend to be of the same shape. And so we want to save as much time there as possible and make it convenient. So in AlgebraOfGraphics, you make a plot by using these three elements: the data, which just points to some usually tabular data source; then a mapping, which connects parts of this tabular data source to elements of the plot; and then a visual, which is just some plotting function you would find in Makie. And most of them work with this system. And then when you combine them, you get something like a facet plot without having to go and place labels everywhere manually and listing all of um, these axis labels and the legend, and so and it can save a lot of time. And so, what is the problem? The initial design was a very thin layer on top of Makie, and that was on purpose, but it had a bunch of problems coming with it. So, for example, it assumed that the positional arguments of Makie plotting functions are always x, y, and optionally z. And this is not true for a lot of functions. For example, you can make horizontal bar plots, or you can make error bars, and these sometimes have different signatures. So you couldn't do them. On the right, you can see a bar plot where, with the old version of AlgebraOfGraphics, you would just have messed up scales pointing to the wrong side. Then there was a problem that aesthetics were detected by name, so it would only work if you had an attribute called color. Otherwise, it wouldn't be recognized as something that represents color. So again, not every plotting function Makie works like this. So this excluded things like stroke color, text color. And then there was a problem that you could only have one scale of a specific type at the same time. And while it's not the most common thing to want to do, it does limit the flexibility of the system quite a bit if you're not able to mix scales of the same type. So this was the reason for the refactor, and it was quite substantial. So on the left, you can see the original work on the package by Pietro, and on the right is the activity that resulted from overhauling it. So a lot of code was added, and now it's much less thin layer, but still only intended as a convenience layer on top of Makie, which doesn't really introduce many plotting semantics itself. So the new thing is that you have keyword-dependent aesthetics now for plot types. So for example, when we show the aesthetics for the bar plot, I cut off a bunch of them here, but you can see the positional arguments can now be dependent on the direction keyword. So they change from x to y depending on direction being horizontal or vertical. And the color, for example, here points to the color aesthetic, which is of the same name, but it could also be any other name, right? So basically, AlgebraOfGraphics knows now what the attributes mean of the plots that you're creating. Then the result of this you can see on the right, where I just plotted the same bar plot specification twice, but I changed the direction once. And you can see that the lower one with the horizontal bar plots switches the axis as expected. So this works now. Then you have multiple scales of the same aesthetic. In this case, I'm again using this penguin dataset, and I'm plotting bill length on the y-axis in both of these facets, so they can share the axis. It's not two separate plots, but it's one facet specification. But I'm setting it up in a way that I have two different x scales, and one of them is actually categorical, listing the species, and the other is continuous. And this works now because you can, with the scale modifier, tell AlgebraOfGraphics that the scale belonging to a mapping is different from the default. So the default would just be the symbol x, and x2 is just some arbitrary name you can give. And I can show how, on the next slide, how you can use this to further customize your plots, because here I'm doing this with color. I'm doing two times a bill length millimeter versus bill depth plot, once with a contour and once with a scatter plot on top. And here the idea was to do a contour plot where you can tell the different species apart by the gray colors, and the sex of the individual penguins is on a different color scale, which again is done with the scale modifier here. And then in the draw call, where you in the new version can actually centrally set all these scale parameters, you can then modify the colors for each of them. So this is much more streamlined than it was previously, where you would have to go by keyword of the plot and set a palette. But as I showed you before, not every color attribute is called color. So if you go by that, then you cannot do it centrally. But now that you set the attributes of the scales, it's all central and easy to understand and easy to change. Then here's another feature that was added recently, which is the presorted mode. Common requirement is to plot some categorical variable, but the data source already has some meaningful order in it, and this pre-sorted helper can be applied to that mapping, and then you can see that the largest element, the elephant, is at the top and the smallest at the bottom, without sorting them alphabetically. Then we have legend entries via label. This was also something that people really wanted to do with AlgebraOfGraphics, was not possible before the refactor. Just adding some stuff on top of other stuff, basically, spoken simply. Like here, I'm plotting the penguin data set in 3 different colors, and then I just, for demonstration purposes, think like, okay, let's put an emperor penguin in there, and this doesn't belong to the same data set, so it would be work to like merge the data sets, do a new scale. In this case, I just make a new layer that I add on top of the spec, which has the label, and then it appears in the legend just as a layer, which is a very common requirement for the kinds of plots that we do, and now you can do it. And the last one I wanted to show is the generic dodge feature. Also a very common ask, that you want to have some bar plots with error bars on top, and before the scales there was not really a way to align these because there was no mechanism, and now there is actually a dodge scale, so the different layers can be checked for wanting to add something to that scale. And here you can see one of the different differences between the plot types, because a bar plot has a dodge feature already built in Makie, because it has a width, so these bars have to be smaller if they are dodged and so on. But error bars doesn't actually have that. So for bar plot, you use the normal dodge parameter, and for error bars, you have to tell it which dimension you want to dodge. And then they both go on the dodge X scale, and the error bars will actually infer the width that they need from the other elements participating in the dodge. So that was the last one I wanted to show. So thanks for your attention. Are there any questions?
Yes.
So the original idea, I feel like, of the algebra of graphics is that you have this algebra, right? So you have a very nice visualization of different components. Oh yeah, stream. Yeah. So the library is called Algebra of Graphics, and the idea there is that you have an algebra, right? So you have a very nice factorization of the components of a plot. And I'm wondering if you can say that as you keep making these improvements to the library, if you feel like the factorization actually becomes more kind of algebraic, more factorized, or if it's in the end actually very difficult to keep a very kind of clean factorization, and it turns out that it converges more to a maybe more generic plotting library that has a lot of edge cases built in, let's say.
I try to keep the edge cases to a minimum, because I want it to work in the semantic way and less like the imperative way that Makie does, just layering stuff on top of each other, and it doesn't matter what the structure is. So that makes integrating some features very hard, but sometimes stuff just falls out of the design. So for example, when I showed you the categorical axis next to the continuous one, I didn't realize that this was possible by the scale design until after I had written it, and then it kind of just fell out of this. So this was actually very nice, that the library started to get more and more features, because the change seemed to be a good one. Right? So yeah, I think it got stronger rather than like more messy.
I think this is the last thing our